Hi, Joe here again. We're here for video number 2 on the series on how I carve pumpkins. And we're going to go ahead and get started by actually scooping one of our pumpkins out. Now, I always like to start by just drawing a circle of where I'm going to cut the lid of the pumpkin. Usually just take a Sharpie and just go around. This does not have to be precise because we're not going to follow it all the way around. And then I like to draw a line towards the back because, well, I like to use a Sharpie that has ink in it, but there we go. Just to indicate where the back of the pumpkin is and also to help line the lid up. And then I'm going to take this tool here, which came with our kit, and I'm really just demonstrating this tool. You can really use just any kitchen knife, and actually other kitchen knives will work much better. And I'm going to stick it into the pumpkin at a little bit of an inward angle because I don't want the uh, lid of the pumpkin to fall in when we're done. And it goes in nice and easy, and you just kind of move it like a saw all the way around. And the lid pops off nice and easy. Now I'm going to hold this over a trash can and cut off all of these seeds here. And then back here where my line is, I like to cut a little notch out. And that is going to be kind of the chimney for our pumpkin if I put a candle in it, which I'm going to. Again, that doesn't have to be perfect, and nobody's really going to see this. There we go. And we can tell by our line here that that's where it lines back up. So we're done with the lid. Next, we're going to start with scooping out the pumpkin. And again, I'm going to use the scoop that came with our kit. And it's got this nice little thumb uh, positioner here, which helps you kind of figure out how to get the right support. And I'm going to start just by scooping on the inside edge at the top. Now, I'm not going to bother to, um, just scoop out and put it in the trash, scoop out and put it in the trash. I'm really just scraping the sides off, and I'll let it all pool in the bottom of the pumpkin. And I'll gradually work my way down. And really, the goal of this is we want to get all these strings off. I mean, of course, we want to get the seeds out. As you get towards the bottom, you want to scrape a little bit more horizontally. And once you got a lot of scraping done, you can go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and dump this. This is actually, good enough. I'll get those seeds out later. But one thing to help you make your design easier is you want to know how thick the wall of your pumpkin is. And really, for the best results from your design, I'm going to take one of these pins. This camera, there we go. One of these sewing pins. It's a little more than an inch long. And I'm going to find a spot here in the middle of wherever I'm going to carve. And uh, it's not really a big deal to make a pinhole. That pinhole is not going to hurt anything if that's something you leave in your pumpkin. Nobody's going to see it. So I'm going to poke it in there. Now, when I get to the inside, I should see the end of that tip, and I don't. So I'm going to scrape some more. I'm going to pull the tip out so I don't hit it, or pull the pin out some, and just start going across the surface of where I'm going to carve. Because the thinner that is, the easier it's going to be to get my design cut out, and the cleaner it's going to be to get details in. You do not need to do this all the way around the pumpkin because nobody's going to notice. I'm going to take the handle off of the pumpkin scoop and work on it more like this with my thumb on the inside here. All right, let's check the pin again. And we can just barely see the tip. See? And that's really thin enough for starters. It means we've got most of the way done. I'm going to scrape a little bit more, especially around the tops and bottom, because where the pumpkin curves towards the top or the bottom, it's going to be just a little bit thicker. But after we get the pattern put on, we can check again and make it the thickness that we want. That's about perfect. You want to see about a 1/4 inch of that pin coming through. And finally, you want to make sure that the bottom of your pumpkin is cleaned off well enough that you can at least get a candle or whatever kind of light you want to put in there and let it sit flat. I like to put a candle, and you don't want that falling over and burning the inside of the pumpkin. Here, Emily's going to demonstrate scooping also, just to show you that it doesn't necessarily take a grown-up to scoop out a pumpkin, because pumpkin guts are gross, and if you can get that stuff on your kids instead of yourself, that's all the better. All right, and show us how it's done.
I may not know how to do it as well, but I do know how to do it a way.
Okay. Now, the inside of your pumpkin is usually going to be very wet and goopy or dry and stringy, but the idea is of scooping the inside is just to get all the loose stuff off. And Emily here is also doing a good job working on the back of her pumpkin, which doesn't need to be necessarily clean to a certain thickness, but it should be clean because when your pumpkin is actually lit from the inside, that's the part you're actually seeing, is the back of the pumpkin being lit up and the light shining through the holes. All right, the next thing we're going to do is get our pattern put onto our pumpkin, the pattern we're going to carve out. And I'm going to demonstrate here with mine. I always like to try and clean off the front, make sure it's nice and dry because we don't want wet paper sticking to it. And I'm going to use one of these patterns that's in this book. I have chosen this one here. It's called Flyby. But as you might notice, the pumpkin is just barely bigger than the pattern itself. And we don't want a pattern that curls up here onto the top part or down to the bottom part, because that's going to warp the pattern, and in some cases you actually get too close to the lid and it just will not hold together. So as long as you have a printer at home that will resize pictures, I like to make a copy and usually resize between 75 and 80% size. And I like to try and make sure the topmost part of the pattern is where the beginning of the flatter part of the pumpkin goes, and it doesn't go so far down to the bottom that it's tucked under. Now, Emily here is going to demonstrate also. Show us your original pattern you made, Em. Emily here made an original design that she wants onto her pumpkin, but she made it on a piece of 8.5 by 11-inch paper. And show your big piece right there on the pumpkin, the big one, Em, where we can see it. And it's way too big. But we shrunk that down to about 85% size, and that's going to be a lot more reasonable for her to carve onto the pumpkin. Okay, Emily here is going to demonstrate how we get the pattern onto our pumpkin. Now, the instructions in the book say to use tape to put the pattern on, but I don't like that because tape doesn't like to stick to the outside of pumpkins, but this is where we're going to use our sewing pins again. So Em, why don't you grab a pin? What Em's going to do here is she's going to put her pattern on the pumpkin, and you're going to put a pin right in the middle of the pattern, in the middle, on a line, on one of the lines. There we go. And stick that in. Now add some more pins. She's going to add some more pins, starting from the center and then gradually extending out. You don't have to do every place, but the idea is to try and get the paper pattern as flush to the pumpkin as possible. Here, Emily's coming up on some of the edges of the pumpkin, and you're going to end up with some folds here, and that's going to be okay. Move your hand, please. You just kind of take a spot and fold it, and you're going to eventually kind of make those lines as straight as you can. And actually, when you do end up with a fold, it's often best to try and put your pin right on that fold to help you keep things lined up. All right, the pattern is now attached. And now we're going to trace it onto the pumpkin by poking holes along the lines. Now, what M's going to do here is use a thumbtack. Let me show the thumbtack, please. There we go. The pumpkin carving kit comes with a tool for poking the holes, but I find because it's made of plastic, it probably is safer, but it also uh, tends to get dull quickly. So a regular thumbtack, however, I find works really well. And all we're going to do is we're tracing the pattern on the pumpkin by poking holes through the lines on the paper, and that's going to leave a hole in the pumpkin. Now, this is different than what's being left behind by the pins, because the pinholes are very, very small, whereas the thumbtack will be much bigger and much easier to see. And right now, for the purposes of this video, Emily is carving or is poking the holes through the pattern while standing up. This can easily be done while sitting at a table. Uh, and it doesn't really matter if your pumpkin is sitting upright or on its side like it is here. In fact, whenever I'm working on a pumpkin, I often work on it with the pumpkin in my lap, and I'm listening to music or watching TV at the same time. And just to show you the pattern from the book that I was using for this demonstration, here it is attached to the other pumpkin, and I'm going to start poking holes. It doesn't matter when you're poking the holes where you start. You just want to be able to leave enough that you can kind of play connect the dots when you're actually carving the pumpkin out later. All right, I'm done punching all the holes through my pattern. Always double check to make sure you get all the lines. Then when you're done, you just take the pins out. I recommend hanging on to the pattern because if you do find out that, hey, you missed some lines, you can always use the holes to line up putting the pattern back on there and poke through. But it also helps to have as a guideline while you're carving so that you, in case you lose track of which dots go in which order. One thing to be careful of is if you have parts of your pattern with really short lines, I recommend putting pinholes really close together so you don't just have them on the corners to help remind you of where to carve. And why don't you go ahead and put a pinhole in between there? Yeah, yeah, that's good. But for the most part, how far apart you keep your pinholes is up to you. If you've got a long straight line, it really doesn't matter that much if they be close together. But when you're working in tight spaces, I recommend trying to put some closer together just to help remind you of where you want to cut. One other thing I'd like to point out is that tracing the pattern onto your pumpkin does not require you to have the pumpkin cleaned out. You can still do that on your intact pumpkin. It's not going to make your pumpkin rot any faster, but when you have really complicated patterns, if you want your pumpkin to last longer after it's carved, you can save some time by getting the pattern traced onto the pumpkin earlier. One thing I will warn you is generally when you do that, more of the juice from inside the pumpkin is going to come out through those pinholes and soak into the paper. And it generally doesn't damage the paper. You just have to be more careful when you remove it from the pumpkin. But it is going to be soggy and messy. Should also mention that if you do carve your pumpkin without hollowing it out, it is much more difficult to get the pins out when you're taking the pattern off. But usually when the pumpkin's been hollowed out, they come off pretty easy. Emily here is demonstrating one of the drawbacks of using the thumbtack is sometimes your wrist does get a little bit sore, especially if you're not used to it. This is our first pumpkin of the year, but the results I think are worth it, especially since it's her wrist and not mine. And there it doesn't show real well through the camera, but there's the pattern traced onto the pumpkin, ready to be carved. And again, as you can tell, it's not exactly obvious in the camera where that pattern is, but some of the pumpkin carving kits actually come with a crayon, and you can use either a crayon or a marker and connect the dots before you carve them. It does make a little bit of a mess while you're carving, but by the time you're done, nobody's going to see that because it's going to be dark outside, and the only thing people are going to see is the light in your pumpkin. And finally, when you're done tracing the pattern, this is a good time to do a pin test also on the thickness of your pumpkin all the way around. It's just find one of the holes you've already poked with your thumbtack and see if that pin comes through the inside. And if you don't see it, you might want to scrape it out some more. All right, we're all done with getting our patterns traced onto the pumpkins, and we've made sure that the pumpkin scraped out enough on the inside, and we're ready to carve, which is what we're going to do in our next video. Thanks for checking this out with us, and we'll see you soon.